Imagine, for a moment, the sheer magnitude of the shock that rippled through the global aviation community when the news first broke. It was not merely a press release, it was a seismic shift in the unspoken rules of the international arms trade. Sweden, a nation renowned for its stoic neutrality, its rigorous ethical standards regarding defense exports, and its fiercely protective stance over its proprietary technology, had officially placed an offer on the table for Canada that was unprecedented in its scope and generosity. They offered 88 Gripen E fighter jets. To the uninitiated observer, or perhaps to the casual reader of headlines, this might have appeared as nothing more than a standard business transaction, a simple case of supply and demand, where Ottawa required aircraft and Stockholm possessed the manufacturing capability to provide them. However, to those of us who have spent decades analyzing the intricate chess game of global military strategy, this was something far more profound. It was an anomaly that demanded an answer to a singular pressing question: why? Why would Sweden, a country that carefully curates its alliances, suddenly offer one of the most advanced, lethal, and secretive combat platforms in existence to a nation like Canada, which has historically been tethered to the American military-industrial complex for the better part of a century? On the surface, it feels like a commercial bid, but once you peel back the layers of diplomatic politeness, what you find is a story that has nothing to do with sales figures and everything to do with the future of Western air power, Arctic dominance, and the survival of sovereignty in the high north. The real reason Sweden offered Canada 88 Gripens is far more shocking, far more strategic, and ultimately far more complementary to the Canadian spirit than anyone initially dared to expect. To truly understand the gravity of this offer, one must first abandon the traditional Mercator projection maps that hang in elementary school classrooms, which distort our perception of distance and separation. Instead, one must look at the world from above, adopting a polar projection, the view from the North Pole. From this vantage point, the geopolitical reality shifts dramatically. You will notice something that most of the world ignores, but that military planners in Stockholm and Ottawa know to be the absolute truth. Sweden and Canada are not distant acquaintances separated by an ocean. We are, for all strategic intents and purposes, neighbors in the Arctic Circle. Both of our nations are custodians of the frozen frontier, sharing extremely harsh climates, vast and unforgiving frozen landscapes, low population densities, and, most critically, enormous swaths of airspace that are constantly being probed and monitored by foreign powers, specifically the Russian Federation. Sweden knows that the Arctic is rapidly evolving from a frozen barrier into the next global battlefield, and they recognized a kindred spirit in Canada, a sleeping giant that, despite its immense territory and strategic importance, had been struggling for nearly a decade to modernize its air defenses. The Swedish defense establishment watched with keen interest as Canada debated endlessly over which fighter jet to choose to replace the aging CF-18 fleet. They saw the political wrestling matches between the F-35 Lightning II and the F-A-18 Super Hornet. They observed the consideration of even older, upgraded fighters, and they noted that nothing seemed to move forward. Ottawa desperately needed jets, but political pressure, budgetary constraints, and the overwhelming gravitational pull of American influence kept dragging the decision into endless bureaucratic loops. It was in this paralysis that Sweden realized something vital, something that perhaps even Canadian officials had lost sight of in the fog of procurement politics. Canada was reaching a tipping point where it needed a partner, not just a supplier. A supplier sells you a product and sends you an invoice. A partner shares the burden of defense and the secrets of survival. Consequently, Sweden stepped in, but not with a normal sales pitch. Their offer was meticulously designed with one singular purpose: to prove that the Gripen isn't just an aircraft, it is a comprehensive solution to the unique existential challenges of being a northern power. Swedish defense officials quietly but firmly highlighted that the Gripen E is engineered from the molecule up for cold weather operations, rapid turnaround times, and the ability to operate from short, icy runways, exactly the kind of unforgiving environment the Canadian pilots and ground crews face every single winter. But to think this was merely about weather compatibility is to scratch only the surface of the strategic intent. The real plan was infinitely deeper. Sweden wanted to create a long-term strategic alliance across the Arctic, a transpolar shield. If Canada adopted the Gripen, both nations could effectively merge their institutional knowledge, sharing training regimens, tactical data, logistics networks, and surveillance intelligence across the entire Northern Hemisphere. Instead of dealing with the United States' incredibly expensive and highly controlled F-35 program, where Canada would effectively be a tenant in a house owned by Washington, Canada would gain far more freedom. Sweden offered a path to autonomy, and in return, Sweden would gain something priceless, a powerful ally with the world's second largest landmass, capable of acting as a massive strategic depth to counterbalance growing Russian activity in the north. Furthermore, Sweden understood that the global fighter jet market was beginning to shift tectonically. More nations were quietly looking for alternatives to the F-35, searching for options that cost less to operate, required fewer political restrictions, and offered more sovereign independence. If Sweden managed to get Canada a G7 nation, a founding member of NATO, and a country with a proud history of aerial warfare into the Gripen family, it would instantly change the global perception of the jet. Overnight, the Gripen would no longer be seen as a niche aircraft for small air forces. It would become mainstream. It would become the definitive choice for nations that value their independence. But to seal this deal, Sweden made a move that caught the defense industry completely off guard. They offered Canada unprecedented industrial cooperation. This was not the standard offset agreement where a company promises to buy some local maple syrup in exchange for jets. This included full technology transfer, local assembly, thousands of high-tech Canadian jobs, and long-term engineering partnerships. This was a level of trust that the United States would never, under any circumstances, offer with the F-35. Why? Because the American doctrine is built on keeping its technology tightly controlled within a black box, while Sweden's philosophy, particularly in this instance, was the opposite: shared development, shared capability, shared strength. However, Sweden's real motive goes even deeper than Arctic strategy or global market competition. Their intelligence agencies, renowned for their capabilities in the Baltic region, saw something alarming in the North American sector. They observed that Canada was slowly losing sovereignty over its own defense decisions, becoming almost fully dependent on American systems, American intelligence networks, and American defense approvals. For Sweden, this dependency was a problem not just for Canada, but for the overall balance of power in the Arctic region. An independent Canada means a stronger Arctic defense network. A dependent Canada means one less ally Sweden can rely on to act autonomously during a major crisis. So, Sweden crafted the 88 Gripen offer as an escape hatch, a strategic off-ramp that would allow Canada to regain military independence without necessarily igniting a political conflict with the United States. It was a brilliant maneuver, and it almost worked. Canadian analysts publicly admitted that the Gripen met more of their specific operational requirements than the F-35. In fact, internal reports that were leaked much later showed that the Gripen scored higher in several critical operational categories, especially in terms of life cycle costs, running hours, and extreme cold weather performance. Sweden's offer wasn't just generous, it was smart, calculated, and strategically timed to appeal to the practical nature of the Canadian soldier. But then, as so often happens in the world of high-stakes defense procurement, the story took a darker, more complex turn. Pressure from outside powers, intense lobbying from colossal US defense companies, and political maneuvering behind closed doors began to heavily influence the process. Suddenly, the Gripen, despite scoring better on paper and offering a superior economic package for the Canadian taxpayer, was treated like an outsider. Sweden knew exactly what was happening. They recognized the invisible hand of geopolitical pressure. But instead of withdrawing their offer, they pushed even harder because they understood that the stakes were far greater than just a fighter jet deal worth a few $billions. This wasn't about planes anymore. It was about control of the Arctic. It was about who gets to shape the future of Western air power in the polar regions. It was about two nations, one small in population but a giant in innovation, and one massive in land, but seeking to reaffirm its place on the world stage, trying to break free from the gravitational pull of superpowers. And that brings us to the moment that defense analysts and historians still debate today: the significance of the number 88. Why 88? Why such a specific non-round number? Why not 60, which would be cheaper? Why not 100, which sounds more robust? The reason behind that number reveals the true nature of Sweden's long game and their deep respect for Canadian geography. The number 88 wasn't chosen randomly. It was not a political figure drawn from a hat, nor was it merely symbolic. It was purely strategic and mathematically derived. Sweden knew exactly what Canada needed, not just in terms of aircraft quantity, but in terms of operational capability across the entire 10 million square kilometers of Canadian territory. To fully secure its northern skies, Canada requires a mix of patrol coverage, rapid interceptability, round-the-clock readiness, and the ability to replace aging CF-18 squadrons without leaving dangerous gaps in the defense line. Internal Swedish analysts, applying their own rigorous models for territorial defense, calculated that 88 Gripens would be the precise critical mass required. This number would allow Canada to maintain continuous Arctic surveillance, rotating aircraft between active duty, training, and maintenance, while still having enough reserve jets to surge into the air during a national emergency. In simple terms, 88 was the perfect number to give Canada total air sovereignty, the ability to monitor its own borders without having to call for help. But this is where things get even more interesting for those who take pride in Canadian potential. Sweden didn't just want to sell Canada planes, they wanted Canada to help shape the next decade of Gripen evolution. The Gripen E is already a powerful aircraft, boasting advanced AESA radar, incredibly low operating costs, and an electronic warfare suite that can blind enemy defenses. However, Canada's geography and unique mission needs could push the aircraft into a new era of development. Sweden envisioned a Gripen North variant, optimized specifically for long-range patrols over the Canadian Arctic archipelago and deep winter operations in conditions that would ground lesser aircraft. If Canada joined the program, both countries would share research, share upgrades, and create the world's first next-generation Arctic fighter. It sounds ambitious. Perhaps almost too ambitious for those accustomed to Canada playing a supporting role. But Sweden was deadly serious. They even offered Canada partial design influence and full maintenance autonomy, no foreign approval required for repairs, no secret black boxes that Canadian technicians aren't allowed to touch, no locked software that requires a password from Washington. Total control. This concept was unheard of in modern fighter deals, where manufacturers usually retain a stranglehold on the technology for decades. That freedom, that offer of absolute sovereignty, was one of the biggest reasons the United States became uncomfortable. A Canadian Gripen fleet would mean Canada no longer needed American approval for upgrades, weapons integration, or mission planning. Washington saw the Gripen not just as a competitor, but as a threat to the cohesion of the North American aerospace industrial base. Not because it was better than the F-35 inches every single category, though in terms of availability and cold weather startup, it certainly was, but because it gave countries too much independence. And independence in defense is something major powers do not like their allies to have. Behind closed doors, meetings were held, promises were made, and the subtle, unspoken threats of diplomatic friction were hinted at. Canada was reminded of shared defense agreements, NORAD commitments, intelligence cooperation, and the risks of diverging too far from the American defense ecosystem. It wasn't an open threat diplomacy among friends rarely is, but the message was clear. Staying aligned with the US would be beneficial, straying would be complicated. Sweden saw the battle shift. What began as a competition of technology, a comparison of thrust to weight ratios, radar cross-sections, and maintenance hours, had now become a competition of influence. And what Canada truly had to decide wasn't which jet could fly better, but which alliance vision they believed in. A future tied tightly to the United States, or a future where Canada stands more independently as a northern power, capable of making its own decisions and building its own industry. Inside the evaluation teams, a surprising truth emerged. The Gripen E was easier to operate, cheaper to fly, and better suited for Canada's environment. It could land on short, icy runways in the middle of a blizzard, disperse to remote highway strips to avoid missile strikes, and be rearmed and refueled by a small team of conscripts or reservists in under 20 minutes. The F-35, while technologically brilliant, required specialized maintenance facilities, climate-controlled hangars, and long turnaround times. Pilots and engineers quietly admitted that the Gripen would save billions in long-term costs, money that could be reinvested into the Canadian forces. But the decision was no longer just about aircraft performance. This is where Sweden played their boldest card, a card that appealed directly to Canadian pride and industrial capability. They offered to let Canada build the jets domestically. This was the ultimate sign of respect. Sweden was essentially saying, "We trust your engineers, your factories, and your workers to build our most advanced machine." They proposed creating thousands of high-tech jobs in Canada, offering full access to the source code so Canada could customize the aircraft however it wanted. They proposed deep defense industrial integration between Saab and Canadian aerospace companies, reviving a sector that had once produced the Avro Aero. They even offered training partnerships with Swedish Air Force units in remote Arctic zones, proposing a brotherhood of northern pilots that no other country could offer. All this wasn't simply generosity. It was a strategic calculation based on the belief that Canada is a sleeping giant of the aerospace world. Sweden understood a basic truth. If the Gripen got even one Tier 1 Western partner like Canada, the entire global fighter market would tilt. Other nations, Finland, Brazil, the Czech Republic, would see Canada's decision as validation. And suddenly, the Gripen would become the world's preferred independent fighter jet, a direct challenge to US dominance. Meanwhile, deep within the classified annexes of the proposal, documents that were only viewed by a select few within the Department of National Defense revealed something even more revolutionary than industrial jobs. The proposed Canadian Gripens were not just standard fighters. They were to be equipped with a bespoke configuration of some of the most advanced electronic warfare systems on Earth. In the modern era, air superiority is no longer solely defined by who has the fastest missile or the tightest turning radius. It is defined by control over the electromagnetic spectrum. Sweden's long-term vision was clear and strikingly ambitious. They wanted to forge a Canada-Sweden Arctic shield. This would have been a unified digital fortress, linking sensors from the Baltic Sea to the Beaufort Sea, utilizing shared data links, shared satellite intelligence, and joint air patrols capable of countering Russian activity across half the northern hemisphere. For the veteran military observer, the implications of this are staggering. In potential Arctic conflict scenarios, where satellite coverage can be spotty and ground-based radar stations are thousands of kilometers apart, the Gripen's EW suite acts as a force multiplier. The aircraft is designed to carry its own electronic bubble, capable of jamming, deceiving, or blinding enemy radars across hundreds of kilometers of frozen tundra. This capability is paramount because, as Swedish intelligence agencies had been warning, the threat landscape in the high north was shifting rapidly. Sweden had one more secret reason for offering Canada exactly 88 jets, a reason tied directly to classified intelligence gathered from the far north. For years, Swedish listening posts had been tracking unusual and alarming patterns. Russian aircraft were flying closer to Canadian and Scandinavian airspace than ever before, testing reaction times. Unknown radar signatures were appearing at high altitudes near the North Pole, loitering for hours before vanishing into the electronic noise of the aurora borealis. Surveillance satellites had detected new Russian listening stations and airfields being revitalized on remote islands in the Arctic Ocean, bases that had lain dormant since the height of the Cold War. Sweden understood the trajectory of history before almost anyone else in NATO. The problem wasn't just sporadic Russian military flights, it was the velocity at which the Arctic was being militarized quietly, rapidly, and strategically. Melting ice was opening new sea routes, creating the first viable trade lanes through the Northwest Passage, and exposing resource-rich territories that had previously been inaccessible. Whoever controls the Arctic controls the future of global shipping, vast untapped energy reserves, and the shortest flight paths for intercontinental ballistic missiles. Sweden realized that the world was approaching a new era of northern competition, and they looked at Canada, a nation that owns nearly half of the Arctic coastline, and saw a partner that was dangerously under-equipped to protect its own inheritance. This context brings the 88 number back into sharp focus. It was not just about logistics, it was about survival math. Swedish strategists had calculated the minimum density of force required to establish a credible deterrent across Canada's nearly 10 million square kilometers. Even under worst-case scenarios, where communications are cut and bases are targeted, 88 units allowed for decentralized operations. The Gripen was designed to be dispersed to roadside bases, hidden in forests or hangars, disguised as civilian barns, operating in small packs that are nearly impossible to wipe out in a first strike. This is the guerrilla Air Force concept that Sweden has perfected, and it is a doctrine that fits Canada's geography like a glove. If tensions escalated, 60 jets would leave the flanks exposed, 100 would be politically unsellable. But 88? That was the mathematical Goldilocks number for total Arctic dominance. Swedish analysts also realized that a future Arctic conflict wouldn't be fought like the dogfights of the Second World War. There would be no massive formations clashing over the chaotic skies of Europe. Instead, it would be a war of silence, sensors, stealth, and long-range detection. This is where the Gripen E shines against its heavier competitors. Its integrated data link is built to talk to everything drones, naval frigates, ground-based air defense systems, and even infantry units, creating a seamless web of situational awareness. Its small radar cross-section makes it difficult to track, and its passive sensors allow it to hunt without turning on its own radar, effectively stalking its prey in the dark. Sweden envisioned a Canadian Gripen fleet forming an invisible net across the north, capable of detecting anything entering Canadian airspace long before it reached populated areas like Edmonton or Montreal. However, Sweden's calculation wasn't just strategic or technological, it was also psychological. For too long, Canada had been viewed by superpowers, both friend and foe, as a secondary player in defense politics, a country that purchased off-the-shelf equipment rather than shaping the future of warfare. Sweden wanted to change that narrative fundamentally by bringing Canada into the Gripen program as a co-developer. They hoped to elevate Canada to the role of a peer, a partner with equal say in the evolution of the platform. This meant shared innovations, shared testing regimes, and a 20-year partnership rooted not in dependency, but in parity. Behind the scenes, Swedish Air Force officers had even prepared a classified joint training proposal that would have seen Canadian pilots leading Arctic survival missions and extreme cold flight trials, effectively making Canada the global center of excellence for winter warfare. But as this vision of a bold, independent Northern alliance unfolded, the geopolitical chessboard moved again. American officials, deeply concerned about losing influence over their northern neighbor, increased their diplomatic pressure. It was not hostile, but it was heavy. They emphasized the critical importance of interoperability with U.S. forces under the NORAD umbrella. They warned about potential delays in certification if Canada chose a European airframe. They highlighted the risks of splitting from the NATO standard F-35 ecosystem, which was rapidly becoming the default choice for the alliance. One by one, Canadian decision-makers began to feel the weight of geography. The United States is not just an ally, it is the guarantor of continental security. The Gripen, despite being cheaper, simpler to maintain, and arguably better suited for the specific rigors of the Canadian winter, was being overshadowed by the immense political gravity of Washington. Sweden sensed the shift. For the first time, they realized that the battle for Canada wasn't technological at all, it was political. And politics is a battlefield where the Gripen, for all its advanced avionics, could not always win against the sheer weight of American hegemony. But even then, Sweden did not withdraw. They pushed harder. They increased the technology transfer offers to levels that bordered on giving away state secrets. They expanded job guarantees to every region of Canada. They committed to sharing sensitive Arctic intelligence that was previously eyes only for Stockholm. They even offered to let Canadian engineers modify and redesign certain Gripen systems to integrate American weapons, effectively bridging the gap between the two worlds. A level of trust the Americans would never grant to a foreign nation. Sweden was fighting not just for a sale, but for an ally, for a partner, and for a future in which smaller nations like Canada and Sweden had more control over their own defense decisions. The story ends not with a contract for Sweden, but with a question that continues to echo through the corridors of the Department of National Defense and among strategists in Ottawa. What if Canada had said yes? What if Canada had chosen the path of independence over the path of integration? What if the Arctic Shield envisioned by Sweden and Canada had become real? Analysts believe the world today would look very different. Canada would possess one of the most agile, cost-effective, and sovereign air forces on Earth. The Gripen would have exploded in popularity across Europe, Asia, and South America, breaking the monopoly of the giants. U.S. dominance in fighter exports would have been significantly reduced, and the Arctic would have a powerful new alliance guarding its skies, a third option between the superpowers. But the most surprising, and perhaps the most patriotic truth to take away from this saga is this: Sweden never made the offer because they needed Canada's money. They made it because they believed the future of northern security depended on Canada stepping up. They saw in Canada a partner with shared values, shared geography, and immense shared potential. They saw a nation that was not a subordinate, but a leader in waiting. They saw a country that could stand beside them in the most remote and strategically important frontier on the planet. And that is the real reason Sweden offered Canada 88 Gripens. Not for profit, not for politics, not for headlines, but for a vision of the Arctic's future where two nations could shape their destiny, protect their sovereignty, and redefine the balance of power. The offer became more than a fighter jet proposal. It became a symbol of the respect the world holds for Canada, a respect that perhaps, sometimes, Canadians need to be reminded they deserve. In the end, the 88 was a tribute to Canadian capability, a number that will forever represent the moment a European power looked across the pole and saw a giant. If this deep dive into Canada's potential as a true guardian of the North resonated with you, please honor us with a like and subscribe for more strategic analysis. We would love to hear your insights in the comments below. First, do you believe Canada should prioritize Arctic-specific capabilities like the Gripen over standard NATO platforms? Second, how important is it to you that we revive our domestic aerospace manufacturing sectors? And third, do you see Sweden as a natural northern brother for our future defense? Thank you for your time and passion. Stay safe, stay proud, and God keep our land glorious and free.